Chapter 3. To Catch a Goose. The Sector 7 Port Authority impound lot sprawled like a fortified graveyard where forgotten ships rusted in exile, sitting at the end of a long, polluted canal, high chain-link fences bristling with sparking razor wire, daring anyone to trespass. Towering floodlights carved harsh, icy pools across the damp ferrocrete, exposing rows of seized freighters, impounded shuttles, and gutted transport skiffs. Finn lingered across the street, the collar of his long, dark overcoat turned up against the freezing drizzle. He traced his smooth, freshly shaven jaw, willing his pounding heart to settle into a cold, steady rhythm. He didn't skulk in the shadows. He didn't look for a blind spot in the camera coverage or a weakness in the perimeter fence. He was Athelgard now. He owned this port. Finn emerged from the shadows and strode straight for the main administration building. The brutalist gray block hunched against the rain, unwelcoming and solid. He shoved through the doors and entered a long, stark corridor, the air thick with the scent of grease and oil. His heavy boots struck the scuffed linoleum with crisp, commanding clicks that echoed down the bare corridor. He moved with the swagger of someone who owned the place, his dark overcoat flaring behind him. At the end of the long corridor sat the primary security checkpoint. It was a fortified circular pod constructed of thick, reinforced plasteel, blocking access to the heavy blast doors that led out into the impound yard. The back wall of the pod was a large pane of reinforced glass, overlooking the entire sprawling lot of seized ships under the harsh floodlights. Sitting inside the pod, chewing aggressively on the stub of a dead cigar, was a heavily augmented man. Half of his face was a mosaic of scarred flesh and cheap, bulky cybernetics, his mechanical left eye whirring softly as he looked up from a glowing holoscreen. Pinned to the chest of his stained Port Authority uniform was a tarnished brass name tag that read, Erebus, Dockmaster. Finn didn't break stride. He walked right up to the thick plasteel window, his dark eyes locking onto the dockmaster. Erebus grunted, hitting a button on his console to activate the two-way external speaker. "Can I help you?" His voice crackled through the static, sounding like gravel grinding against a bulkhead. His organic eye narrowed suspiciously, taking in Finn's sharp, immaculate charcoal suit and slicked-back hair. "George Blake." Finn introduced himself smoothly, projecting absolute authority through the speaker. He didn't offer a badge or a physical ID chip. He simply stood perfectly still. "I'm here for the ship, the Silly Goose." Erebus frowned, leaning back in his squeaking chair. The name of the ship clearly meant something to him, but he wasn't convinced. He crossed his thick arms over his chest, the whirring of his cybernetic eye suddenly loud even through the plasteel. "The Silly Goose is under a Class 3 containment lock," the dockmaster said slowly, testing the waters. "Port Authority seized her yesterday. Official business. I don't know any George Blake, and I certainly didn't authorize a release." Finn didn't blink. He leaned forward slightly, bringing his face inches from the scratched plasteel, his cold, dark eyes level with the dockmaster's organic one. He let the silence stretch for a long, uncomfortable moment, forcing the tension in the narrow corridor to a breaking point. "You didn't authorize it," Finn purred, his voice dropping to a deadly conspiratorial whisper that cut perfectly through the static of the speaker. "Because Athelgard Corporation doesn't require your authorization, Erebus. We require your compliance and your discretion." The name of the corporation hit the dockmaster like a physical blow. Erebus flinched, his thick arms dropping to the console. Suspicion melted into a sheen of nervous sweat. Finn's logic was razor sharp. If anyone in Sector 7 was pocketing Athelgard credits to bury a murder, it was the man in charge. Athelgard. Erebus breathed, his voice dropping to a harsh, hushed tone. He glanced nervously out the massive window behind him, as if expecting a tactical cleanup crew to be marching through the impound lot. He leaned close to the microphone, his cybernetic eye twitching. I wasn't expecting you yet. The cleanup crew at Dock 44B hasn't even finished scrubbing the pad. I thought the containment team was coming tomorrow for the ship. I was expecting Carver. Finn's heart hammered against his ribs, but his face remained perfectly still behind the scratched plasteel. Carver. He didn't know who Carver was, but the image of the man in the charcoal suit standing coldly over his brother's murder flashed instantly in his mind. The man in charge of the wet work. The man Finn was currently trying to impersonate. Finn straightened, flicking an invisible speck from his charcoal sleeve, his face settling into a mask of bored impatience. Plans change, Erebus. Finn dismissed the dockmaster's worry with a cold, negligent wave of his hand, leaning fully into the arrogant corporate persona. Carver is busy. I am here now, and that is all that matters. Do you have a problem expediting the release? No, sir. Erebus stammered quickly, abandoning his cigar stub in a crowded ashtray. He frantically tapped a sequence into his holoscreen, overriding the security locks on the impound registry. No problem at all, just crossing the T's. You know how it is. I don't, Finn lied smoothly. I simply expect results. Erebus swallowed hard, hitting a final key on his console. A heavy metallic clank echoed through the corridor as the massive blast doors beside the security pod unlocked. He slammed his hand down on a battered intercom button embedded in his desk. Vance! Erebus barked into the crackling speaker. Get up to the main gate, now! A moment later, a skinny, terrified-looking subordinate in grease-stained overalls scurried out from a side door, practically vibrating with nervous energy. Escort Mr. Blake to Bay 12, Erebus ordered through the window, pointing a thick, cybernetic finger at the subordinate. The silly goose. Override the physical seals and give him total access. No delays? The skinny subordinate nodded furiously, gesturing toward the heavy blast doors. Right away, boss. Right this way, sir. Finn didn't look back at Erebus. He gave a curt, dismissive nod and followed the subordinate through the security gate, his heavy boots echoing loudly as they stepped out into the freezing, smog-choked drizzle of the impound lot. Finn let out a slow, silent breath through his nose. Under the heavy fabric of his long, dark overcoat, his heart was hammering wildly against his ribs, but his face remained a mask of cold, corporate stone. He had done it. He had stared down the corrupt heart of Sector 7 through an inch of plasteel, played the deadliest poker game of his life, and won. He was walking toward Leon's ship. The Sector 7 impound lot was massive, a labyrinth of rusted hulls, stripped landing gear, and towering, silent freight transporters. The freezing drizzle cut through the harsh lights, pooling in wide, oil-slicked puddles on the cracked Duracrete. Finn trailed Vance, who scurried ahead like a startled rodent, grease-stained overalls flapping in the wind. Finn kept his head high, posture rigid, refusing to flinch as the cold gnawed through his charcoal suit. Midway across the yard, nestled between the hulking wreckage of two dismantled haulers, Vance suddenly paused. Sitting against a rusted pylon was a battered, humming, automated vending unit, its cracked screen advertising synthetic meals and caffeinated slop. Vance nervously tapped a grimy credit chip against the scanner, waiting as a small plastic cup dropped into the dispenser with a hollow clunk. Sorry, sir. Vance stammered, pulling the steaming, grayish liquid from the machine. Low-fat synthetic broth. Haven't eaten since my shift started. Can I offer you anything? A stim calf? Some protein paste? Finn eyed the vending unit, his corporate mask faltering for a heartbeat. The idea of swallowing anything from that battered relic, likely untouched since the last corporate war, made his stomach turn. No, Finn said flatly, his voice devoid of emotion. Keep walking. Vance swallowed hard, nearly spilling his soup as he scrambled back to the front. Yes, sir, right this way. We're almost there. They turned down a wide, shadowed lane between two towering cargo haulers, and Finn's heart did a painful, complicated flip in his chest. Sitting alone in the middle of Bay 12, bathed in the sickly yellow glow of a single overhead floodlight, was the silly Goose. She wasn't sleek or dark like the Emerald. The Goose was an older model, a heavily modified bulk freighter painted a faded, chipped industrial orange. She was significantly larger than Finn's ship, her hull thick and blocky, dominated by an expanded lower cargo bay that could haul 3 times the freight Finn could manage. She was a good ship, stubborn, reliable, a true workhorse, but speed had never been her strength. Finn felt a sudden, sharp pang of grief, accompanied by a familiar, brotherly flash of competitiveness. He remembered the argument they had over a drink when Finn had first bought the Emerald. Leon had laughed at the dark, streamlined hull, calling it a toy for impatient thrill-seekers, while proudly slapping the thick orange plating of the Goose. Finn had shot back that his brother was just jealous because the Emerald could run circles around the flying brick Leon called a ship. Leon had always valued capacity over speed. Finn had always preferred outrunning trouble rather than weathering it. Here she is, Mr. Blake, Vance mumbled, tossing back the last of his gray soup and tossing the plastic cup into a nearby puddle. He pulled a heavy decryption pad from his overall pocket and walked up the lowered primary loading ramp. The airlock door was plastered with heavy red containment seals bearing the insignia of the Sector 7 Port Authority. Vance didn't hesitate. He slapped his decryption pad against the magnetic lock, his fingers flying across the keypad. The heavy seals clicked, hissing as the pressure released, and the thick Durasteel airlock door slid slowly open with a grinding screech. "She's all yours, sir," Vance said nervously, stepping back and gesturing toward the dark interior of the ship. "The primary logs are intact. Nobody's been inside since the dockmaster ordered the tow." Finn didn't look at the subordinate. He walked slowly up the ramp, his heavy boots echoing on the metal grating. He paused at the threshold, the familiar smell of engine grease, stale coffee, and recycled air washing over him like a physical blow. It smelled exactly like Leon. "Wait by the bottom of the ramp," Finn commanded over his shoulder, his voice tight and completely uncompromising. "I require privacy, and if anyone interrupts me before I am finished, I will have Erebus deal with you personally." Vance went deathly pale at the mention of the name. He scrambled down the ramp, practically throwing himself against the landing strut. "I won't let anyone near you, sir! Not a soul!" Finn stepped into the airlock and hit the manual override. The heavy Durasteel door hissed shut, plunging him into the quiet, familiar gloom of the silly Goose. He was finally alone. He stood in the dim emergency lighting, the air scrubbers humming a low, rattling tune he had known since he and his brother first walked on board. The smells of engine grease, stale coffee, and Leon were overpowering. For a long, agonizing moment, the cold, corporate mask of George Blake cracked, and Finn had to press the heels of his hands against his eyes to stop the sudden burning sting of tears. He forced himself to breathe, rolling his shoulders beneath the charcoal suit. There would be time to grieve later. Right now, he had a ghost to chase. Finn walked purposefully through the cavernous, empty lower cargo hold, his boots echoing against the ribbed metal decking. He climbed the narrow spiral companionway that led up to the crew deck, bracing himself for the flood of memories as he keyed open the hatch to the main living quarters. It was the most bizarre, jarring sight in the entire outer rim. The interior of the Silly Goose looked less like a deep space bulk freighter and far more like a hunting lodge lost deep in the woods of a forgotten planet. The walls of the main lounge had been meticulously paneled in dark-stained synthetic oak. Plaid, overstuffed armchairs sat around a large, low table. At the far end of the room, a surprisingly high-end holographic fireplace crackled, casting a warm, flickering orange glow over the entire cabin and accompanied by the synthetic, comforting smell of burning pine. Mounted on the paneled walls were several exotic hunting trophies Leon had bartered for over the years, and resting in a polished display rack above the hollow fire was a long, beautiful, fully functional antique projectile rifle. Finn stood in the doorway, a tight, aching smile touching his lips. He had spent hundreds of hours in this room. He and Leon had sat in those armchairs, drinking cheap ale, arguing over shipping routes, and staring into that fake fire while the endless void slipped past the viewport outside. Leon had put up the vast majority of the credits to buy this ship 10 years ago, and he had claimed full creative control of the naming and decorating rights. He had named it the Silly Goose, an affectionate, embarrassing callback to what their mother used to call them when they were tearing through the dust of the bone pit as wild boys. Finn had been allowed to decorate his own small bunk room exactly as he pleased, but the rest of the ship was an unapologetic monument to Leon's eccentric, fiercely independent spirit. Finn walked slowly across the plush rug, his hand brushing against the back of one of the plaid armchairs. He couldn't stay here. The memories were too loud. He pushed through the forward bulkhead door and stepped onto the flight deck. The cockpit was cramped, utilitarian, and smelled strongly of the harsh, synthetic cigars Leon preferred. The two worn, leather-backed pilot chairs where they had begun their careers together sat entirely empty in the dim light. Finn didn't hesitate. He walked past the co-pilot's chair and lowered himself heavily into Leon's seat. It felt wrong. It felt like trespassing. But he reached out, his fingers flying across the familiar analog toggle switches and physical keyboards, bringing the ship's primary console out of sleep mode. His first priority was the data. Finn pulled a thick, encrypted data spike from the inner pocket of his dark overcoat and jammed it into the primary terminal. He quickly bypassed Leon's standard security lock, a password he had known for a decade, and initiated a rapid total download of the flight logs, the navigation history, and the encrypted comms records directly to his wristcom. He watched the progress bar inch across the screen, the soft ping of the completed transfer echoing in the quiet cockpit. He would tear the data apart line by line once he was safely back aboard the Emerald. He pulled the data spike free, slipping it back into his pocket. His job here was technically done. He had the manifest. He could walk down the ramp, nod to the terrified Vance, and march right out the front gates of the impound lot. But as Finn sat in his brother's chair, gazing through the plasteel viewport at the rusted hulks imprisoned behind Sector 7's razor wire, a fierce wave of defiance surged through him. He wasn't leaving her here. If Athelgard and Carver were willing to drop a shipping container on a pilot to hide a secret, they would absolutely destroy the Silly Goose the moment they realized someone was asking questions. If Finn walked away now and wasted hours commuting back across Echelon to retrieve his own ship, the Goose might be a pile of molten slag by the time he returned. Finn gripped the yoke of the pilot's chair, his dark eyes narrowing. He was the only other person in the galaxy who knew the trick to starting this stubborn, beautiful brick of a ship. Finn reached under the edge of the primary console, his fingers finding a small, hidden black analog button wired directly into the ignition manifold. He pressed and held it firmly. With his other hand, he punched a rapid, complicated 6-digit startup sequence into the main keypad. Deep in the bowels of the ship, the sublight engines let out a heavy, rattling groan before roaring to life with a deafening, vibrating thunder. The emergency lights flicked off, replaced by the bright, humming, operational glare of the flight deck. Finn's hands flew across the controls, immediately initiating the closure sequence for the primary loading ramp. He glanced down at the external security monitors glowing on the console. On the screen, Vance was standing in the freezing drizzle, staring up at the closing ramp with a look of absolute, unadulterated horror. The skinny subordinate was waving his arms frantically, his mouth wide open in a silent scream of protest as the engines roared, drowning him out. The heavy Durasteel airlock slammed shut, the magnetic seals locking with a heavy, final clank. Finn didn't smile, but adrenaline surged, sweeping away his grief. He had crossed the point of no return, stealing a multi-ton freighter from a fortress of corporate power in the heart of the capital, and he felt entirely, absolutely justified. Finn grabbed the flight yoke, pulling back hard. The anti-gravity repulsors screamed, and the silly Goose lifted heavily off the cracked Duracrete, blasting a shockwave of dirty rainwater across Bay 12. He didn't bother requesting clearance from Echelon traffic control. He simply threw the thrusters forward, ripping the massive orange ship into the smog-choked sky, leaving Sector 7 far behind. His destination was set in the nav computer. Echelon Apex Port. Docking Bay 413. Right next to the Emerald. Back in the primary security checkpoint, the heavy, vibrating roar of a massive sublight engine shaking the Ferrocrete bunker barely registered with Erebus. The dockmaster was too busy staring at the impeccably tailored, charcoal-gray suit of the man standing on the other side of the reinforced plasteel window. The man's posture was rigid, his hands resting casually in the pockets of his long, sweeping, dark overcoat. His sharp, angular features and slicked-back hair radiated an aura of quiet, chilling authority. Erebus chewed nervously on his dead cigar stub, his cybernetic eye whirring as he looked at the genuine, high-level Athelgard corporate identification flashing on his holoscreen. "I don't understand, Mr. Carver," Erebus grunted, genuine confusion bleeding into his gravelly voice. "Are you with the containment team?" Carver's expression didn't change, but he leaned a little closer. "I am not the containment team, Erebus. I am here to personally inspect the impounded vessel registered as the Silly Goose. Immediately." Erebus swallowed hard. But one of your colleagues is inspecting the ship right now. Mr. Blake. He arrived not 10 minutes ago." Carver went perfectly still. His jaw tightened, a dangerous, barely suppressed fury tightening the lines of his face. "Athelgard does not employ a George Blake, and I work alone." Before Erebus could process the horrifying reality of what he had just done, the heavy blast doors beside the security pod slammed open. Vance sprinted into the corridor, drenched in dirty rainwater and panting heavily. He practically threw himself against the plasteel window, his eyes wide with absolute terror. "Boss!" Vance screamed, his voice cracking hysterically through the external speaker. "The Goose! He's taken off in it!"